Auzubillahiminash-shaytanir-rajeem. Bismillahir-Rahmanir-Rahim. By the grace of God and by the name of God, we'll start this session. First, I'll read to you a few of my favorite verses from Quran. These are verse 17 to 22 of Surah Al-Ghashiyah. Bismillahir-Rahmanir-Rahim. أَفَلَا يَنْظُرُونَ إِلَى الْإِبِلِ كَيْفَ خُلِقَتْ وَإِلَى السَّمَاءِ كَيْفَ رُفِعَتْ وَإِلَى الْجِبَالِ كَيْفَ نُصِبَتْ وَإِلَى الْأَرْضِ كَيْفَ سُطِحَتْ فَذَكِّرْ إِنَّمَا أَنْتَ مُذَكِّرٌ لَسْتَ عَلَيْهِمْ بِمُسَيْطِرٍ Sadaqallahu al-Azim. We are beginning a scientific session today, and these verses quite aptly ask us to look at the world around us, see how the camel was created, how the skies were raised, how the earth was spread out for us, and how the mountains were fixed upon it. With these verses, I'll begin the first session, and I would like to ask the chairs. General Tasawwur Hussain, please. Professor Sadiq Ajak, sir. With the permission of the chairs, I'll ask the first speaker to start his talk. That will be Dr. Shahab Abid from Karachi. He's online, and he'll be talking to us about motility disorders of esophagus, what to do.
Ji, Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much for a very kind invitation to participate in 37th Annual Congress of Pakistan Society of Gastroenterology and GI Endoscopy. The topic for my presentation is the esophageal motility disorders, and I will share the practical approach whenever we are seeing patient with motility disorder. Next slide, please. Next, please. Okay, there is nothing to disclose. I shall start with few cases. The case one is a 39-year-old male presented to GI clinic with complaint of chest pain and dysphagia. His cardiac workup done for chest pain, which turned out to be normal. Gastroscopy and barium swallow was done, which were also reported normal. And then he underwent a further evaluation with high resolution manometry. Next, please. The case two is a 61-year-old lady presented with the complaints of dysphagia that was worsened over time. And also there is a questionable weight loss. Gastroscopy showed normal mucosa of the upper esophagus, and then there is slight resistance at the lower esophageal sphincter area. She underwent barium swallow that shows slight holding of contrast at gastroesophageal junction. And she also underwent a high resolution manometry. Next, please. So something about high resolution manometry, because this high resolution manometry is the mainstay in the evaluation of patient with esophageal motility disorder. And nowadays, the motility disorder of the esophagus are classified according to the findings on high resolution manometry. Next, please. Next, please. Well, esophageal manometry, in which we will use a nasal single intranasal transnasal device, and after putting it, it's just like in a nasogastric tube. We will place it in the lower esophageal sphincter area, and then we'll ask the patient to take 10 wet swallows, and which all contain of 5 ml of water. And if we are using a solid straight catheter, then the position is semi-prone. And if we are using a Nemo hydraulic system, which is a water perfusion system, then the patient should be in the supine position. Next, please. Next. please. Next. So this is the typical features of an esophageal manometry tracing. You can see the upper portion, which is a horizontal bar, is representing the upper esophageal sphincter area. The lower arrow, which is showing as an horizontal bar, is the lower esophageal sphincter. In the middle, there is a contractile activity which is going on in the body of the esophagus. The pressure dynamics in all these three areas has been reflected in terms of this scale, which is given in a horizontal as a vertical bar on the left side. And this is a geographical topical mapping. Based upon that, the pressure amplitude is being changed into different color intensity, and this color intensity specify or reflect the amount of the pressure there. Next, please. So the stepwise approach by high resolution manometry is assess three things: assess the esophageal gastric junction. It also characterizes the contractile vigor and pattern in the body of the esophagus, and identify the intrabolus pressure pattern. So based upon these three parameters, we classify esophageal motility disorders. Next, please. So integrated relaxation pressure is one of the most important parameter which we evaluate for the assessment of lower esophageal sphincter relaxation. Because if this lower esophageal sphincter is not relaxed appropriately, it will produce the symptoms of dysphagia. And nowadays, with the high resolution manometry, when we use this particular thing, high resolution manometry, the lower esophageal sphincter is reflected by IRP, integrated relaxation period, in 4 seconds. And the pressure period in these 4 seconds should be less than 15 millimeter of mercury. So if it is more than 15 millimeter of mercury, then it is abnormal. Next, please. The second parameter which we evaluate by high resolution manometry is to characterize the contractile vigor and pattern. The contractile vigor is being classified as normal, failed, weak, or hypercontractile state. And likewise, the contractile pattern will be either normal, premature, or fragmented. In the subsequent slides, you will see that how these things are reflected on high resolution manometry. Next, please. Next. So there are few definitions which we use in evaluating the high resolution manometry. One is the contractile deceleration point, the distal latency, and distal contractile integral. Next, please. So this is the slow rate of phase of esophageal emptying, and this point. Next, please. It will be the distal CDP, where there is a slowed late phase of esophageal emptying. Next, please. On the other hand, the point from the point of the swallowing, and then there is slow late phase. Next, please. Is the point of distal latency. So this is the area which is a distal latency. Next, please. Volume is basically a combination, next please, of the three things. One is the amplitude, the other is the duration, and third one is the length. So a product of these three parameters will let us know the assessment of the volume, how much is being taken up by the esophagus, and it is being propelled downward towards the stomach. Next, please. So on the left side, you can see in this panel that there is no effective peristaltic activities going on. So it is basically a failed esophageal peristalsis. On the right panel, there is contractile activity going on, but it is a weak peristalsis. Next, please. And this one is showing an hypercontractile activity in the body of the esophagus. You can see that the volume, the amount, and the color depicts that it is a very high pressure zone, and it is being calculated at more than 11,000. Anything above 5,000 is abnormal, and more than 8,000 is qualifying for another disease entity, which is called jackhammer esophagus. Next, please. Next. So in this case, there is a high volume pressure, but there is a decreased distal latency. So if a combination of high volume and with a decreased distal latency, it is coming into the category of premature esophageal contraction. Next, please. Fragmented, you can see that there is a big breakup in the proximal part of the esophagus. So this is a characteristic findings on for the fragmented esophageal contractile activity. Next, please. Pan-esophageal pressurization. Here you can see that there is no definite pattern of contractile activity, but it's just kind of a squeezing kind of contraction going on in the body of the esophagus. And it may be a pan-esophageal pressurization, which is squeezing and ineffective. The second one, it could be a compartmentalized area, which is being abnormally contracted. And all these parameters will give rise to symptoms of dysphagia, in which gastroscopy is essentially normal, and barium swallow may be plus minus. Next, please. So this is just in a capsule nutshell, few parameters which we evaluate as an abnormal one in esophageal manometry. The first row is 3 varieties of achalasia. The second one is indicating the EJJ flow obstruction, and then there is jackhammer esophagus. And then in the corner, there is absent peristalsis. Then there are certain minor disorders of peristalsis, which is called the inefficient esophageal motility, fragmented peristalsis. And if we exclude all these, then we will come to the conclusion that the contractile activity is normal, and we will say that this is a normal is high resolution manometry. Next, please. So based upon these findings, International HRM Working Group, which has designed and set the parameters of defining the esophageal motility disorders with a hierarchical approach to subsequently prioritize disorder of EGG outflow, major disorders of peristalsis, and minor disorders of peristalsis. Next, please. This is the most important slide, which is going to tell you what are the various type of the esophageal motility disorders. So they are divided with this dotted red line into the major disorders and the minor disorders. So in the major disorder, the first and foremost thing is to know about the IRP. If the IRP, integrated relaxation pressure of 4 seconds, is more than 15 millimeter of mercury per square centimeter, and there is 100% failed peristalsis, or there is spastic, then it fulfills the criteria of one of the type of the achalasia, type 1, when there is no contractile activity, and type 2 and type 3, which probably Ghasso Nabitaia will let you know in his presentation on achalasia management. So in IRP, if more than upper limit of normal, but there is no type 1, 2, and 3 achalasia, then it will be labeled as EGJ outflow obstruction or incompletely expressed achalasia. Or it may be a reflection on high resolution manometry of some kind of mechanical obstruction. And if these 2 parameters are not there, it means that the IRP is within normal limit, and there is short latency or high DCI or 100% failed peristalsis. Then the parameters of diffuse esophageal spasm is being used. This term is used, and the jackhammer esophagus term is used when the distal contractile integral is more than 8,000 millimeter per square centimeter. And if out of 10, if the 2 contractile activities are showing DCI of more than 8,000, it will fulfill the criteria of jackhammer. Likewise, if the average contractile activity of of or the DCI is more than 5,000, then it will fulfill the criteria for nutcracker esophagus. So these are the major disorders of the esophageal motility, which based upon the IRP of more than 15 millimeter of mercury, and those in which its IRP is within normal range. When these things are not there, then and if these are all normal, then if IRP is normal and if it is more than 50% ineffective swallows, then it is an ineffective motility disorder of the esophagus. And that includes either the simple failed peristalsis or fragmented peristalsis. So if the computer calculate that there is upper IRPC within upper limit of normal, and there is good contractile activity, the pressure zone is less than 5,000, and there is no fragmentation or no failed peristalsis, then the computer will label this as a normal esophageal motility. So it's a hierarchical approach from the severest form of motility disorder, which is achalasia, to esophagogastric junction obstruction, and then so on and so forth. Next, please. So let's go back to the case number 1 with a 37-year-old male presented with GI clinic with complaint of chest pain, and GD and barium was unremarkable. Next, please. So this particular case is showing a very intense pressure area in the body of the esophagus. You see that it's giving you a very large volume and a very strong contraction depicted by the violet color. And this is basically more than 8,000 millimeter of mercury and qualify jackhammer esophagus. Next, please. So you can see here is 8,070. Next, please. Next. Next. So the other case was a 61-year-old lady was presented with complaint of dysphagia again. Next, please. And these are the parameters here, that there is not a very effective contraction, which is peristaltic activity, but there is a central area which is showing a spastic kind of esophageal body contraction. And look at in the right panel, bottom line, where there is an IRP of 4 seconds is more than 15 millimeter of mercury. So these two parameters qualify as achalasia. Next, please. So finally, I'm just going to discuss in next 1 minute a case which we have discussed, which we have seen in the last couple of months back. Next, please. Next. He's a 55-year-old gentleman referred for evaluation of dysphagia, and he had difficulty in swallowing both for liquid and solids, and he's lost around 8 kilograms of weight as well. He underwent upper GI endoscopy and barium, both were reported normal. Next, please. In the absence of structural abnormalities, the two likely disorder which can cause dysphagia are either a gross motility disorder or a functional dysphagia. So next, please. So we did the high resolution manometry on him. Next, please. And this is the feature here. You can see that it is showing a prolonged, persistent, high volume contraction, which is going on in the body of the esophagus, which is meaningless, but it is just going into the spasm. The esophagus is going into the spasm. And if you see on the right side that the DCI is more than 13,248, and it qualifies for the term of jackhammer esophagus. But if you see in the in the bottom right side, LES, IRP is more than 30.9. So it is more than 15 millimeter of mercury. In pure jackhammer, the IRP is within normal range. But here the contractile activity of the body of the esophagus is in the domain of jackhammer, and the IRP is in the domain of the achalasia, which is failed to relax the lower esophageal sphincter. So a combination of both, it may be the early vigorous achalasia or it is jackhammer associated with achalasia. Next, please. Next. Next. So this is the barium esophagogram, is showing slight hold and a bit narrowing, but essentially it is reported unremarkable. Next, please. And we did the upper GI endoscopy, and there are several parameters of several ways of dealing with the achalasia, and that will be discussed in the later talk. Next, please. So in this particular case, what we did is we did the achalasia dilatation. Next, please. And following achalasia dilatation, we also use the Botox injection in the lower 1/3 of the body of the esophagus in order to relax the smooth muscles and an attempt to relax the smooth muscle. And we obtain a very good results in terms of the improvement of this patient's dysphagia and gaining weight. So this is just a reflection of what is going on as far as the body of the esophagus and the esophageal motility disorders are concerned. So my take-home message from this presentation is just to let you know that whenever the patient is complaining of symptoms like dysphagia, and we evaluated and found that there is no structural cause for this dysphagia, then we need to subject such patient for high resolution manometry. And high resolution manometry will let you know whether there is some kind of the functional problem going on in the esophagus, or it is some kind of other disorder of neuropsychiatric in origin. So for functional evaluation of the body of the esophagus, high resolution manometry is essential component if gastroscopy and barium swallows are normal. Thank you very much for your kind attention. Next, please. Next. Next. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shah Abid. That was very nice lecture. Very few departments, even with large volumes of endoscopies, do a lot of esophageal work, and I'm sure this will go a long way towards sensitizing other GI colleagues to start doing more esophageal work, which is definitely needed in Pakistan. Thank you very much, sir. Our next speaker is going to be a dear friend and colleague. He is HOD of a large department of military, and he has a lot of volume that he looks into about himself, and he's got a lot of trainees doing work for him. He'll be speaking to us on GERD. This is state-of-art lecture, and invite Professor Farrukh Saeed for that.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum and a very good morning. It is so heartening to see some of the great names in gastroenterology sitting here, like Janata Sarwar, Professor Masood Siddique, Sir Wasim, and Professor Vyas. And I must commend and appreciate the efforts by Professor Masood Siddique, who in fact inspired and took all the initiatives to arrange this meeting in a very difficult time. I will very briefly discuss gastroesophageal reflux disease. And we all encounter this clinical situation almost daily in our clinical practice. Patients, they present with so many different diverse spectrum of symptoms, at times typical symptoms. We treat them. Patients respond partially, and again they come back with the same symptoms. And we will just go through what can be the causes of persistent or refractory symptoms. So main emphasis will be on refractory GERD. So I will start with a real-time patient. We had a patient, 37 years old female, who presented with 3 months history of intermittent dull epigastric pain with nausea. She also reported occasional sweating with pain. And on further inquiry, she revealed that she revealed that she did experience retrosternal burning, due to which she was reluctant to take food, and she felt some improvement in her symptoms with intermittent use of PPI. There was no history of blood pressure, diabetes, use of NSAIDs, or any substance use. Next. Extensive workup of cardiac and then liver functions, ultrasound, pancreas, they were all normal. Next. ECG was normal. Next. Echo was normal. So all workup was normal, and eventually it was decided to do an endoscopy. Next. So endoscopy was done. Next slide, please. And these are the this is the picture of the lower esophagus, which shows significant ulceration and erosions in the lower esophagus. Next. So she was started with she was given advice for her lifestyle modification. The dose of PPIs was optimized, and she did report improvement in her symptoms after 4 weeks. Next slide, please. However, there was recurrence of symptoms after 12 weeks, despite being on medication. So the question which was in the mind of the treating physician or gastroenterologist was whether he is treating a refractory GERD, while the patient was thinking that she may be having something else. So this is a dilemma which we usually encounter in our clinical practice, and we will just see what can be the reasons. Next slide, please. So although PPIs, we think that they are the mainstay of treatment and they are the ultimate solution, but actually this is not the case. So current evidence shows that 40% of patients with non-erosive reflux disease, they may remain symptomatic despite being on standard medication. And 10 to 15% of patients with erosive esophagitis, they will not achieve full remission after 8 weeks of treatment. And we know that refractory GERD is persistence of symptoms and unresponsive, which is unresponsive to optimal PPI dosing for at least 12 weeks of treatment. And up to 30% of GERD patients, they experience refractory GERD. So let's see what can be the key reasons and causes of refractory GERD. Poor compliance to PPI or medical advice is the main factor, and this is the #1 cause of persistent symptoms. So poor compliance and adherence should first be assessed before we label someone as having refractory GERD. And studies have demonstrated that up to 50% of patients with heartburn, they are not compliant with the medical advice. One of the studies that showed that 55% of patients, they take PPA once daily for 4 weeks, and only 37% they took it for 12 or more days. So compliance remains one of the factors which should be explored in patients who have persistent or refractory symptoms. Eosinophilic esophagitis is another emerging entity which we see in our clinical practice. We must think of this thing once someone is having recurring symptoms despite being on treatment. So eosinophilic esophagitis is one should be considered in all the individuals with such clinical picture. We must very diligently rule out cardiac issue, And patients, they may have underlying biliary colic. There may be something in the gallbladder or CBD. So all these things, they must be seen very diligently. There is another entity which is functional heartburn and functional esophageal disorders. This consists of a disease category that presents with esophageal symptoms in the absence of mechanical obstruction, motility disorder, and actual gastroesophageal reflux disease. So this is another entity which remains one of the refractory symptoms. They persist in this group of patients. Occasionally, we encounter that patients with eclasia, they have continuing symptoms, and once we explore, we do endoscopy or some barium study, then we see that the underlying cause is eclasia. There is another concept of postprandial gastric acid pocket, which has been that has been seen to be the cause of recurring symptoms. And in this, there is a pocket of acid where pH is low between actual gastric content, that is food, and the esophagus. So this may be another cause of symptoms which are persisting despite being on treatment. Then nocturnal acid breakthrough, we all see patients who are well in the daytime while they have symptoms at night. So this is due to a lowering of pH. Sorry. This is a lowering of the pH at night, and these patients require further treatment modalities. And then there is PP refractory heartburn, which in this category of patients or subgroup of patients, despite being on PPIs, they don't respond to their symptoms, they persist. So these are all different causes of persistent symptoms.
Assalamu alaikum. I'm Dr. Naima Alam, Junior Consultant Gastroenterology, and I'll be representing Military Hospital Rawalpindi. The topic of the research paper is outcome of patients with acute severe necrotizing pancreatitis in dedicated hepatobiliary unit of Pakistan. Now, what's new about this research paper? The study is one of the few studies from Pakistan detailing minimally invasive therapeutic strategies. This is the largest cohort of infected necrotizing pancreatitis reported locally. Also, this is the only study with an extensive antibiogram, and it also shows an extensive follow-up and outcome measures. The objective of this study is to analyze the management of severe necrotizing pancreatitis in a specialized center of a lower middle income country, that is Pakistan, using multiple outcome measures. Now, the reported incidence of acute pancreatitis ranges from 13 to 45 per 100,000 per annum population, with around 15% presenting as necrotizing pancreatitis, 42% of which become infected later on. Acute pancreatitis has been following an increasing trend during the last 40 years, with an incidence of 20 to 40 cases per 100,000 population per annum in some of the countries. The mortality of acute pancreatitis ranges from 4 to 25%, with 50% of the deaths documented happening in the first 2 weeks of acute insult, and the rest due to multi-organ failure, infected necrosis, sepsis, and in-hospital complications. The morbidity and mortality outcomes in severe necrotizing pancreatitis are governed by the presence of infected necrosis, sepsis, and multi-organ dysfunction. Now, the data for this prospective study was collected from January 2017 to December 2019 at Military Hospital Rawalpindi and included all those patients treated in the hepatobiliary ICU for severe necrotizing pancreatitis. The exclusion criteria included those patients with chronic pancreatitis and those presenting with acute on chronic pancreatitis. The patients presenting after 3 months of disease onset, mild or moderate severity, and non-consenting patients. The indications for drainage included difficult to manage pain, clinical deterioration, obstructive symptoms, and infected collections. Minimally invasive drainage was done with drains ranging from 9 to 32 French according to collection size and the consistency of the aspirates. Complete resolution of the collection was documented if the drain output was less than 20 cc for 24 hours. EUS-guided transluminal drainage with placement of single or multiple double pigtail stent was done as a step-up procedure. Surgical necrostectomy was offered as the last resort for those showing progressive organ dysfunction and deterioration on non-invasive regimen. The main outcome measures included in-hospital complications. That includes infected and sterile necrosis, splenic vein thrombosis, pneumonia, ascites, single or multi-organ failure, bleeding, and gastric outlet obstruction. Also, that included interventions, both minimally invasive as well as invasive, length of the hospital stay, nutritional support, intravenous antibiotics, and extensive biograms, number of the drains and their duration, as well as mortality, which was our main outcome. Now, this figure shows the demographic data for our patients. As you can see that 57 patients with a CT size score of 8 or more than 8 were enrolled. 72% of them were males, and the mean age was 50 plus minus 11 years. 54% of the patients had a CT size score of 10. The median duration of hospital stay was 39 days with IQR of 15. Mechanical ventilation was provided for 14 patients. EUS-guided drainage was required for 14% of the patients, and surgical necrostectomy was done for 10.5% of the patients. This slide shows the percentages of different etiology of acute pancreatitis for our study sample, where here you can see that gallstone pancreatitis was the most common etiology. That was followed by idiopathic, tobacco use, post-ERCP, hypertriglyceridemia, and then alcohol, only 2%. The authors believe that this 2% alcohol might be underreported because of the stigma that is attached with disclosure. And this idiopathic might include alcohol-induced pancreatitis as well. This slide shows the comorbidities, and you can see that a huge chunk, that is 45.6% of our patients, did not have any comorbidities. The comorbidities that we did see were diabetes, hypertension, ischemic heart disease, and a combination of those. In order to minimize translocation of bacteria and the incidence of infection in pancreatic necrosis, enteral nutrition has always been considered paramount to help with sustaining intestinal mucosal barrier. Where here you can see that only 5.3% of the patient could tolerate orally in our study cohort. 35% required NG only. Partial TPN was required by, with NG was required by 28%. NJ 24.5%. Partial TPN with NJ 5.3%, and 2% of the patient required TPN for pancreatic and gut rest. The most common complication for our cohort was infection in the pancreatic necrosis or peripancreatic collection, and that was 84%. This was followed by acute kidney injury, splenic vein thrombosis, ascites, pseudocyst formation, hospital-acquired pneumonia that also included VAP, that is ventilator-associated pneumonia, multi-organ dysfunction, and respiratory failure. Bleeding fundal varices requiring sclerotherapy were seen in 3.5% of the patient. Now, our mortality was 12.3%, and this has been seen to be lower as compared to many other studies that we studied for our literature review. And there was one review article that estimated that the total mortality of acute pancreatitis can be as high as 42%. As I mentioned in the beginning, that our study is the first local study to include an extensive antibiogram for the infected pancreatic and peripancreatic collections. None of the infected pancreatic necrosis or peripancreatic collection yielded multi-resistant or gram-positive organisms, and the antibiogram showed reasonable sensitivities towards many of the antibiotics commonly we use in the ICU. So the three most common organisms that were isolated from the aspirates were E. coli, Klebsiella, and Pseudomonas. And you can see that tazobactam, meropenem, and colistin, they are showing reasonable sensitivities towards these organisms. Okay, now this table is actually a Cox regression analysis for determinants of mortality in our patients with acute severe pancreatitis. Now here you can see that age, gender, and the CDSI score, these three did not statistically correlated with the mortality of our patients. And the reason might be that all of our patients had actually a CDSI score of 8 or more than 8, and that effectively eliminated the temporal effect of severity on mortality. And our population sample was also of younger age, that is 50 years. So that might be one of the reasons for that as well. Now over here, we have mechanical ventilation, surgical necrosectomy, and circulatory failure with multi-organ failure. These 4 determinants were responsible for mortality through Cox regression analysis in our study. Mortality has been seen to be statistically associated with surgical necrosectomy, mainly because of the morbidity and strong inflammatory response associated with surgical manipulation, leading to further deterioration of the failing organs. There is a local study that has actually reported a mortality of 26% in post-surgical necrosectomy patients, and that's a local study. So in conclusion, the survival rate of patients with acute severe necrotizing pancreatitis is good in a dedicated hepatobiliary unit, where there is a multidisciplinary team approach for management, including gastroenterologists, interventional radiologists, and hepatobiliary surgeons. Percutaneous drainage of pancreatic collections has turned out to be an important procedure in resource-deficient countries to manage infected pancreatic necrosis that helps to avoid a morbid procedure in the form of necrosectomy. Circulatory failure and multi-organ dysfunction are the 2 determinants of worse prognosis and need prompt diagnosis and aggressive management. Thank you for your patience.
Percentage of smokers who develop pancreatitis is very, very low as compared with percentage of patients who undergo ERCP and then develop pancreatitis. So it may not be fair to combine the 2. Right? It won't match.
Sir, but we had only 57 patients, and that was like only severe pancreatitis. So probably we might have a sample bias here.
Yeah, because the incidence is extremely different. You can't combine. Second, it may not be fair to say that the surgical necroscopy was used as a last resort.
Right, sir.
It's better to say that it was done in patients who had larger lesions, which were not manageable by the endoscopic.
Right, sir.
And the third thing, in the conclusions, you mentioned percutaneous drainage. While initially you mentioned most of the drainages were done endoscopically.
No, sir. Most of them was done percutaneously.
They were percutaneous.
And step up was EUS guided.
Otherwise, excellent, very good presentation. Thank you very much.
Sir.
और जो इंसिडेंट्स वाली स्लाइड की पीछे जा रही इंसिडेंट्स वाली जो बात करते हैं
Sir. So we actually found 2 of the etiologies. That's why we combined that. Stigma associated with disclosure as well. Sorry, sir, smoking. Smoking as well as chewing, इसलिए इसको tobacco कर दिया. Thank you. Should I start?
Assalamu alaikum. I'm Dr. Faiza Sadakat Ali, consultant physician and gastro fellow at Dow Medical College, Civil Hospital, Karachi. First of all, I thank you all for giving me the opportunity to present my work on this forum. So, topic of my paper is, are we missing varices by implementing Baveno 6 recommendation of not doing screening endoscopies in patients with compensated advanced chronic liver disease? A single center study and Dr. Ruth Kempfau, Civil Hospital, Karachi. Recommendation for screening endoscopies for varices in early cirrhotic is different in different setups. The Baveno 6 criteria propose the utility of non-invasive markers of avoiding screening endoscopies in patients with compensated advanced chronic liver disease, that is, who have liver stiffness measurement of less than 20 kPa as measured by liver elastography, a platelet count of more than 150,000, as these patients do not have significant number of varix needing treatment, that is VNT. We critically analyze this recommendation in our setup by looking at the missing VNT if following Baveno 6 recommendation. So, objective of my study was to validate variceal screening protocol in patients with compensated advanced chronic liver disease as per recommendations of Baveno 6 in our region. So let's have a look of what is compensated advanced chronic liver disease. It is defined by liver stiffness measurement of equal to or more than 10 kPa, CTP class A, and absence of dry liver decompensation. Baveno 6 criteria says that patients who have liver stiffness measure of less than 20 kPa and a platelet count of more than 150,000 do not need to undergo screening endoscopy. Varix needing treatment was defined as the presence of esophageal varix equal to or more than F2 or esophageal varix of any size with red well sign or any size of gastric varix on endoscopy. Varix not needing treatment was defined as varices of F1 without red well sign. So, a cross-sectional study was carried out on in and outpatient of Medical Unit 1 and Endoscopy Unit of Civil Hospital, Karachi from March 2020 to Feb 2021. A sample size of 24 was calculated using PASS version 19.03 software using reported pool sphere endoscopy rate of 32.8%. So we included all patients of compensated advanced chronic liver disease, as I already mentioned, that is having liver stiffness measure of equal to or more than 10 kPa, CTP class A, and absence of dry liver decompensation from any cause, of age between 18 to 60 years, undergoing screening endoscopy. We excluded if the patient gave the history of decompensation episode, that is ascites, variceal hemorrhage, hepatic encephalopathy, or variceal endoscopic treatment. Patients with limitation to undergo or interpretation of the result of transient elastography, that is hepatic congestion, acute hepatitis, metabolic liver disease, extrahepatic cholestasis, BMI of more than or equal to 30 gram per 30 without, or if the patient was without 8 hours of fasting. If the patient gave us the history of current hepatocellular carcinoma or other neoplasm, or if there is history of splenectomy, interferon-based antiviral treatment within 3 months, as both splenectomy interferon-based treatment cause alteration in the platelets count. If the patient was already on non-selective beta blocker or any contraindication in performing endoscopy like severe cardiopulmonary disease, or if the patient was desaturating to less than 90 or deranged coagulation. History was taken and recorded for demographic variables like age and gender. Laboratory workup for CBC, PTINR was carried out in Central Laboratory CHK by a trained staff on automated machines. Liver stiffness measurement was calculated with transient elastography using a FibroScan device at the right lobe of the liver after patients fasted for at least 8 hours. The M-probe was used in all measurements. Grading of varix needing treatment was determined by trained endoscopists who had experience of more than 2 years and were unaware of platelet count and FibroScan result. Informed consent was taken from all patients fulfilling inclusion criteria and then segregated according to the study protocol into 2 groups based on liver stiffness measurement and platelet count. As group A, which is screening group, having liver stiffness measurement of equal to more than 20 kP and platelet count of less than 150,000. This is that group who, according to Baveno 6 recommendation, should be screened. And we also made a group B, which is non-screening group, having liver stiffness measurement of 20 kPa and platelet count of more than 150,000. This group B is that group who, according to Baveno 6 recommendation, should not be screened and they do not need screening endoscopies. Both groups' endoscopic findings were segregated into 3 categories, that is varix needing treatment, varix not needing treatment, and no varix. Mean and standard deviation of continuous variables such as age, while frequency and percentages of categorical variables such as gender were calculated. Frequencies of varix needing treatment, varix not needing treatment, and no varix were calculated and compared among both groups. To generate 2x2 table, varix not needing treatment and no varix were merged. Sensitivity, specificity, negative predictive value, positive predictive value, missing VNTs, and spared endoscopies were calculated. So let's have a look on our results. We included 134 patients who fulfilled this inclusion criteria. That is compensated advanced chronic liver disease, as already defined, that liver stiffness of more than or equal to 10 kPa, child class A, and absence of liver decompensation. We grouped in 2 groups. Group A, screening group, we had 72 patients who were having liver stiffness measure of more than 20 and platelet count of less than 150. And group B, which according to Baveno 6 recommendation do not need to undergo screening endoscopies, that is liver stiffness measure less than 20 and platelet count of more than 150. We found that in group B, there were 12 patients having varix needing treatment who, according to Baveno 6 recommendation, should not be screened. Okay. Thank you so much. This is the main results. So we conclude that if strictly following Baveno 6 recommendation, we can miss 19.4% of varix needing treatment. So we recommend that all patients of cirrhosis should be screened for varix in our setup if the facility is easily available. Thank you.
डिफाइन कर सकें कि ये ग्रुप को हम कैसे आइडेंटिफाई कर सकते हैं, कोई आपने उसको स्टडी किया?
Sir, please repeat कीजिएगा question.
Last group,
Group B.
Group B, जिसमें either there was no varix or there were no varices needing treatment, right? इसको हॉट को आपने स्टडी किया कि इसमें कोई ऐसे पैरामीटर्स है कि इनको आइडेंटिफाई करने में आसानी हो सके?
No, we simply just include the patients of compensated advanced chronic liver disease, and we just, there were no, we didn't see. We just we just included 2 parameters like platelet count and liver elastography.
So what you mean to say is that in spite of these criteria, differentiating the 2 groups to a large extent, still you would recommend that at least once a patient with established cirrhosis should have an endoscopy done.
Yes.
To look for varices.
Yes. If the patient, yes.
Any
If the patient is having
with
cirrhosis,
established cirrhosis should have at least one.
Yeah, it should,
endoscopy.
yes. If
A
all
screening-
patients
a
of
screening
compensated
endoscopy.
advanced chronic liver disease with established cirrhosis should be screened for endoscopy. This is what I want to mention over here, because there is 19.4% of patients who were just missed.
Of the 72 who did need endoscopy as per Baveno 6, उनमें कितने को varices निकली थी?
Okay.
Excuse me. Excuse me.
Sorry, Ji.
How many patients did you wrongly screened according to the Baveno 6 and your criteria? How many patients were wrongly screened when they were not needing any treatment?
Yeah, that means there were 12 patients who were
Right.
needing treatment.
No.
But-
यानी ऐसे कितने पेशेंट थे जो आपने स्क्रीन के लिए उनको ट्रीटमेंट की जरूरत नहीं थी, हालांकि बविनो के मुताबिक तो उनको ट्रीटमेंट की जरूरत, लेकिन आपने स्क्रीन कर दिया?
जी, that means in group A, आप पूछना चाह रहे हैं ग्रुप A में कितने लोग थे जिनको स्क्रीनिंग की जरूरत नहीं थी? That is your
और आपने
question?
स्क्रीन कर दिया उनको?
उनको हमने स्क्रीन कर लिया.
हाँ,
जी जी
इसका मतलब है ज्यादा को जरूरत ही नहीं थी, आपने स्क्रीन कर दी उनको।
It was not like that. 66%
हाँ?
in group A, there were 66% who were correctly needing the endoscopic screening.
The 12 out of 62 requiring
Yes.
endoscopic treatment is quite a high figure actually, because it is quite a serious
Yes,
problem.
majority of patients in group A were having the varices, but even if in group B there were 12 patients were those who were missed if we do not do screening endoscopy. That was the main result.
That is the real message.
Okay. Thank you so much.
हारिस अहमद है जी, आइए जी। Tronoscopy in elderly patients.
रीस्टार्ट कर दें, टाइम रीस्टार्ट कर। Assalamu alaikum to all. I am Dr. Hafiz Haris, gastroenterology resident in Jinnah Postgraduate Medical Center, Karachi. I am very grateful to Pakistan Society of Gastroenterology who gave me the chance to present my paper on clinical profile and outcomes of colonoscopy in elderly patients. It's an experience of a tertiary care hospitals in Karachi. As we all know, March is the month of colorectal cancer awareness, and this paper will be the milestone of developing guidelines on CRC screening for the societies like Pakistan Society of Gastroenterology. Colonoscopy is a widely established procedure used for screening, assessment, and therapeutic management of colorectal diseases. In elderly, it is a reliable practice of great diagnosis like diagnosis of colorectal cancer, polyps, ulcerative colitis, infective colitis, etc., as well as management like polypectomy, CRE balloon dilatation, etc. Worldwide, colorectal cancer is the second most common cancer related death, and it is the fourth most common cancer diagnosed as a malignant disease. This map is showing blue is the incidence and red is the mortality. As you can appreciate that dark color is having incidence of more than 32 and white color is having incidence of less than 5.4. Pakistan is in the region having incidence of less than 5.4. It is from World Health Organization 2012. My objective of this study is to determine the clinical profile and outcomes of colonoscopy in patients aged equal to and more than 50 years present in tertiary care hospitals, Karachi. This study was conducted from July 2012 to August 2020 and completed in 8 years. And it occurred at Department of Gastroenterology in JPMC and National Medical Center, Karachi. And it is an retrospective cohort study. We included all patients of age equal to and more than 50 years who underwent colonoscopy. And we excluded all patients who have incomplete records. We enrolled 2,299 patients, among them Male patients were 1,218 corresponding to 53%, and female patients were 1,081 corresponding to 47%. Among these patients, the most common indication for doing colonoscopy was abdominal pain, followed by rectal bleeding, then constipation, which is 514 patients, 449 patients, and 360 respectively. If we talk about the findings in these patients, among these 2,299 patients, the most common findings was internal hemorrhoids, which is 18.4%, followed by polyps, which is 299 patients, equivalent to 13%, and diverticulosis, 174, equivalent to 7.6%, and fourth one is colonic mass, which is 148, equivalent to 6.5%. The patient who had internal hemorrhoids were 424, and this pie chart is showing that male were predominant, which is 228 corresponding to 72%. The patient who had polyps were 299, and in this category, male was also predominant. And the most common indication for doing colonoscopy was abdominal pain and PR bleeding. 174 patients had diverticulosis, in which equivalent gender distribution is, which is among male and female, and abdominal pain was the most common cause of indication for doing colonoscopy. The fourth one was colonic mass, which is found in 148 patients, and it also had male predominancy. 67 patients were male with 55%, and 81 patients were female, 45%. And this graph is showing that PR bleeding was the most common indication for doing colonoscopy, which is 40 patient, 27%. We have divided patient having colonic mass into different regions and found that most common colonic mass was found in rectum, which is 64 and 43.2%. We also divided patient among age groups between 50 to 60, 61 to 70, and more than 70, and found that the patient who had age of 50 to 60 most commonly found as colorectal cancer. Among these total patients of 2,299, 640 patients have normal examination with equivalent distribution of gender, and the most common indication for doing colonoscopy was abdominal pain. We also divided these patients into 3 categories of ages: 50 to 60, 61 to 70, and more than 70, and found that 50 to 60 patient age group has more diagnosis of normal examination. As you recall the previous slide, that this age group has 2 categories, that even colorectal cancer is also common in this age group, and we also found that normal examination was also common in this age group. So I concluded this paper that in our population, the most common finding in patient age equal to and more than 40 was internal hemorrhoids, followed by polyps, diverticulosis, and colorectal cancer. The percentage of colorectal cancer in our population was found to be 6.5%, which is increases from the previous study, and which is an alarming situation. I recommend that the colonoscopy of elderly patient is a primary tool for diagnosis of colorectal cancer and pre-malignant conditions like polyps, and it is a life-saving. Awareness program should be conducted on national level to decrease the burden of CRC.
The polyps, how many of, do you have a classification of what type of polyps they were?
Sir?
Polyps,
Yes, sir.
what different types of polyps were there?
Patients who are found to be polyps were different types: diminutive polyps, large polyps, and most common of the patient had diminutive polyps. And we did not concluded the result of biopsy. We all this study of cross-sectional study.
Okay.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. We could not say that this can apply to the whole population of the Pakistan, but patients who are coming with the even simple complaint of abdominal pain or just PR bleed of more than 50, they should be screened with colonoscopy.
Okay. ठीक.
Thank you.
Lajpat Rai.
Assalamu alaikum everyone. My name is Dr. Lajpat Rai. I am a gastroenterology resident at Jinnah Postgraduate Medical Center, Karachi. First of all, I would like to thank Pakistan Society of Gastroenterology for giving us the opportunity to present my research. So the topic of my study is COVID-19 associated liver injury, GI manifestations, challenges and outcome. It is a real life experience from Pakistan. Introduction. Patient with novel coronavirus disease 2019, that is COVID-19, experienced various degree of liver function abnormalities and GI manifestations. Liver injury requires extensive workup and continuous surveillance and can be multifactorial and heterogeneous in nature. In the context of COVID-19, clinician will have to determine whether liver injury is related to an underlying liver disease, drug used for the treatment of COVID-19, direct effect of the virus, or a complicated disease course. So the objective of the study is, it was aimed to determine the hepatic and GI manifestations, challenges, and outcome associated with COVID-19 liver injury. Our secondary aim was to study whether the degree of liver injury was associated with the severity of COVID-19 or not. So methods, data collection included demographic data, laboratory data, including levels of ALT, AST, gamma GT, alkaline phosphatase, total bilirubin, albumin, creatinine, hemoglobin, platelet count, and INR. So these, all the parameters were recorded at the time of admission, during hospitalization, and at the time of discharge. Liver test abnormality was defined as elevation in the following parameters, that is ALT of greater than 40, AST of greater than 40, gamma GT of greater than 49, and alkaline phosphatase of greater than 135, and total bilirubin of greater than 17.1 micromole per liter. Liver injury was defined as ALT or AST level greater than or equal to upper limit of the normal, and alkaline phosphatase and gamma GT and total bilirubin greater than or equal to 2 times of upper limit of the normal. Statistical analysis was performed to compare clinical manifestation and outcome associated with COVID-19 associated liver injury. Severity of liver disease was assessed by NHSRC COVID-19 2020 guidelines. So this is the slide showing a Ministry of National Health Services regularization, in which they have categorized the severity of COVID into following categories, that is asymptomatic, mild, moderate, and severe. This is a slide showing pathophysiology of the COVID-19 infection, that how does it lead to hepatocellular necrosis. So the main culprit of this hepatocellular injury is ACE2 mediated targeting of cholangiocytes by COVID-19, which will ultimately lead to cytopathic effect, which will cause the cytokine storm and will lead to hepatocellular necrosis. Material and method, it is a cross-sectional type of study, and it started in April 2020 till to date, and it took place at Jinnah Postgraduate Medical Center, Karachi, Pakistan. The inclusion criteria: patient or attendant who consented to participate in the study, all admitted patient of COVID-19 PCR positive at Corona Isolation Unit. The exclusion criteria: patients or attendant who did not give the consent, hepatocellular carcinoma, and other malignancies. If we talk about the results, so this is the slide showing patient distribution. So up till now, we have enrolled 103 patients in our study, among which we have categorized these 103 patients into two halves. On one hand, we have liver dysfunction on admission, and on other hand, we have 45% of the patient who had normal liver function on admission. In the category of liver dysfunction on admission, we have divided these patients into two categories, that is pre-existing liver disease or no pre-existing liver disease. In the category of pre-existing liver disease, we have these following diseases, which are, that is 37% of the patient were CLD secondary to HBV, 4% of the patient were on chronic hepatitis C treatment, 29% of the patient had NAFL and metabolic syndrome, and 4% of the patient had alcohol-associated liver disease, while 25% of the patient had chronic liver disease secondary to HCV. If we talk about the other hand, that the patient who admitted on the day of admission, their LFTs were normal. So those patients whose LFTs were normal throughout the course of the disease, those patients got excluded, and those patients were 30%. And the patients who had liver dysfunction, like they developed deranged LFTs during the hospitalization, those were 70%. So COVID-19 severity in patient with pre-existing liver disease, we have total 24 number of patients in this category, among which 58% were in child class C, 25% were in child class B, and 17% in child class A. In child class C, 79% of the patients were in severe category, 21% of the patient in moderate category, and in child class B, the 83% of the patients were in severe, 17% of the patients were in moderate, while in child class A, 50% of the patients were in moderate, and 50% of the patient were in mild category. The interesting thing in this slide is to note that none of the patient was in severe category in child class A. COVID-19 severity in patient who with no pre-existing liver disease. So we had 67% in severe category and 33% in mild category. And this is the slide showing patient with liver dysfunction during hospitalization. Like at the time of admission, their LFTs were normal, but they developed deranged LFTs during the hospital course. So we have 70% of the patient in this category, among which 87 were in mild category of the COVID, and 6% of the patient were in moderate category, while 7% of the patient were in severe category of the COVID-19 infection. If we talk about the GI manifestation in patient with pre-existing liver disease, so 46% of the patient were included in this category. Among those, 84% complained of loss of appetite, 41% patient complained of diarrhea, 14% patient complained of nausea and vomiting, and 6% patient complained of abdominal pain. So due to shortage of the time, I'm moving on to the last slide, which is basically showing the conclusion. Yes, outcome of the patient with deranged LFTs on admission. So in mild category, the hospital stay was 14 days, and unfortunately one patient died in this category. And in moderate, we had the duration of hospital was 17 days and 3 patients got died. So moving on to the conclusion, can you please just last slide left. So COVID-19 infection is associated with liver injury and GI manifestation in patient with abnormal liver test were at increased risk of progressing to severe disease and poor outcome. Similarly, HBV, HCV, NAFLD, and cirrhosis, especially child class C, is associated with poor outcome. So the recommendation are severity, mortality, and incidence of complication in various liver disorder, that is HBV, HCV, alcohol-associated liver disease, cirrhosis, drug-induced liver disease, need to be examined in a large cohort of clinical studies. How different underlying liver etiology stages influence liver injury in patient infected with COVID-19 need further study. Thank you so much.
Okay. One, did any of these patients have remdesivir?
No, sir. We have actually the drug-induced liver injury was an exclusion criteria, so we did not include those patients who got drug-induced liver injury.
In your conclusion, you said that Delhi should be observed, but there was nothing in your study which shows that you observed any patient of Delhi. So how can you make a recommendation on Delhi when you have not studied anything?
Yes, sir, exactly. As I mentioned earlier, that was the limitation of my study.
Why mention it?
Because, sir, if a patient, the reason behind that was if a patient is admitting in hospital in COVID isolation and he's having normal LFTs at the time of admission.
इनकी conclusion की slide लगाइएगा जरा बेटे.
Sorry.
Conclusion वाली slide लगाइएगा. Second last. इससे ऊपर वाली is associated with liver injury and GI manifestations. How can you conclude that?
What
Your
you
conclusion
mentioned
is-
that poor LFTs were associated with the higher mortality.
Yes, sir, exactly.
Was this factor independent of other factors like their HRCT finding, like their D-dimers, like their CRP?
Yes, sir. I have the slide because of the shortage of time. I did not mention this slide. These are the factors which affected the outcome in the study population. In this slide, we have significant p values in the following parameters, and those were age, cardiovascular disease, hypertension, child class C, PT, albumin, CRP, TLC count, and creatinine.
No mention of the CT findings,
No, sir, we did not proceed.
because
for
that
this.
becomes a very important prognostic factor in these patients, CT finding.
Yes, sir, exactly. But because
If
of
it-
the unavailability of the HRCT in the center, we did not proceed from the HRCT.
Some patient must have undergone
Yes, sir.
HRCT.
Exactly.
They could have been included.
Yes,
Lastly,
you're right,
बेटे
sir.
ये आपने study खुद ही lopsided कर दी because you studied only admitted patients.
Yes, sir.
So there would be a lot of patients who were mild enough to go back home or being observed in home who were not been included in the study. So mild वालों को तो आपने बहुत सारों को ऐसे ही बाहर कर दिया. So conclusion criteria के ऐसे study lopsided हो गई towards patient who were serious anyway, serious enough to get admitted at least.
Sorry, sir, I did not get the question.
Okay, thank you.
मेरे-
Can you repeat
Okay.
the question? I can answer.
And it was just a comment, it was not a question, but
alright.
बाद में कहता मैं तो बताऊंगा ये गलती क्या
Alright,
थी
thank you,
तुम्हारी.
sir. Correct.
मसूद मोहम्मद करीम.
Assalamu alaikum and good evening, everyone. I am Dr. Masood Mohammad Kareem, postgraduate trainee, Al Khan University Hospital. First of all, I'd like to thank Pakistan Society of Gastroenterology for providing me opportunity to present my abstract here. I'm really honored. And I'm also thank my supervisor for his presence. Okay, so without delay, I come to my topic, current etiological pattern of non-variceal upper GI bleed and its outcome. So I have nothing to disclose. The presentation outline are introduction, rationale, objectives, material and method, results, conclusion, and limitation of this study. So for introduction, the peptic ulcer disease was a cause of more than 50% of non-variceal upper GI bleed. Nowadays, due to easy accessibility and frequent usage of PPI, there's a significant change in etiology of non-variceal upper GI bleed, especially in Western world. Recent studies suggest disease is now a less common cause of about 20 to 25%, and other disorders such as esophagitis becoming comparatively more common. So therefore, the presence of a passage of time and the change in the etiological trend, it's mandatory to know the etiological pattern, complications, and outcome is rebleeding mortality in our part of the world. So objective of my study is to determine the etiological pattern of non-variceal upper GI bleed and those who present with upper GI bleed. And secondary objective is to assess the risk factor, complications, outcome associated with non-variceal upper GI bleed among the patient visiting in tertiary care hospital. So this study was conducted with a single center and retrospective at Al Khan University Hospital with a 3-year duration from January 1st, 2016 to 31st December 2018. All patients were included in the study who presented with GI bleed and underwent endoscopy. The pediatric population were excluded. The 18 onward patients were included in the study. So in exclusion, those patients who had esophageal or gastric varices, portal gastropathy due to any reason, or tumor bleed were excluded from the study. As I mentioned, the pediatric population were included in the study. So in this duration of 3 years, total 729 patients were included, and variceal bleed and other causes, there were 540, those patients who didn't undergo endoscopy. We had only 189 patients of non-varicose apogea bleed. So statistical analysis were done using the central tendency variation calculation, quantitative data, and the frequency of bleeding association factor, endoscopic finding, and outcomes shows in percentage. So if we see here the baseline, total number of patients 189, and the mean age was 58. The male predominancy we can see here 70%, and the female 30%. If we see the comorbids, hypertension 51% is seen here, diabetes and ischemic heart disease in 29%, and CKD 9.8. If we see the CVAs 11. If we just look at the medication, aspirin was noted in 16% of patients and clopidogrel in 5.8. Although NSAID were 2.6%, and anticoagulation warfarin was seen in only 10 patients. The history of melena in 73%, and NG blood aspiration was noted in 53 patients. So as we mentioned that the etiological pattern, so endoscopic etiology pattern we see just location wise. So pain esophagitis was seen 3.7, distal esophagitis in 21%, and GE junction ulcer in 14%. So gastritis and gastric ulcer we can see here, I marked it red at 46% and 28%, and Delafoy lesion in 4 patients, gastric AVM in 2 patients, and we see here duodenitis and duodenal ulcer also significant, and AVM only in 2 patients seen in duodenum. So out of 189 endoscopic intervention done in 61 patients, sclerotherapy was done in 10, and organ plasma coagulation in 8, sclerotherapy plus APC in 32 patients, sclerotherapy, APC and Imoclap in 7, and sclerotherapy and Imoclap in 4 patients. And there were 6 patients who underwent radiological angioembolization, and the 1 patient underwent surgical intervention. So to conclude the clinical outcome, so rebleed was noticed in 9 patients, 4.8%, and the readmission with rebleeding was noticed in 13 patients. Patient clinical follow-up in a stable condition were significant number, 80%. The majority, mortality in hospital or within 30 days were seen in 3 patients, and the patient they were lost to follow-up were 21. So in conclusion of our study, non-varicose apogea bleed is more common in male gender as compared to female. Endoscopic finding indicates gastroduodenal site is still a major cause for non-varicose apogea bleed in our population, contrary to Western population where recent studies support esophagitis and esophageal ulcer is a major finding. However, the multicentric prospective studies are needed to validate. There were some limitation of our study. Single center, retrospective, and small sample size, medical history of PPI and H2N were not evaluated in detail. H. pylori status was not assessed. Thank you.
You mentioned aspirin separate from NSAIDs. What is aspirin if not an NSAID?
Yes, sir. So I'm just mentioning is therefore we have a number of patients with ischemic heart disease. They are taking aspirin and clopidogrel. So I mentioned NSAID other than aspirin specifically these medication.
What kind of gastritis or gastric ulcers were seen?
Okay, so this study is a part of our, you can say one part of our study. We evaluated these patients in the detail, mild gastritis, moderate gastritis, and severe gastritis, even the ulcer with Forest class classification. So here I just mentioned this is a broad category of gastritis, but we are going to work on this of mild, moderate, and severe later on.
Did you find any, it's the portal gastropathy also?
So, sir, photogastropathy patients were there, as I mentioned, those were excluded. Sorry.
So they were excluded.
They excluded.
And any comment on the type of gastric ulcer you saw? Were the malignant ulcer, the benign ulcer, the erosion, the deep ulcer, the
So ulcer was classified as on porous classification, and those patients were already known as a malignant and came out to malignant, they were excluded.
Thank you, बेटे.
Thank you. Thank you.
ये सुबह से 2-3 दफा बात हो चुकी है. Anybody who's in this house will wear a mask, and that mask will cover the nose, sir. Excuse me. Everybody, the mask will cover the nose also. मेरे ख्याल में सो रहे हैं शायद.
those were sleeping or excluded?
बेटे इनका जरा नाक पे करा दीजिए ऊपर. अनीशा खेमानी, तुम तंग कर रही थी फोन कर करके. ठीक.
Assalamualaikum everyone. My name is Dr. Hanisha Khemani and I am resident gastroenterologist in Jinnah Postgraduate Medical Center, Karachi. Today I am here to present my research topic on fulminant hepatic failure, etiology, clinical manifestations and outcome, and experience of tertiary care hospital of Karachi, Pakistan. Introduction. Fulminant hepatic failure is a term given to an acute liver injury causing sudden deterioration of hepatic function and encephalopathy within 8 weeks of appearance of first symptom in a patient having no prior liver disease. There are certain risk factors associated with fulminant hepatic failure, and these are viruses that include hepatitis A virus, hepatitis E virus, hepatitis B virus, less frequently cytomegalovirus, herpes simplex virus, varicella zoster virus, dengue. Other than viruses are drugs and toxins that include paracetamol, phosphorus, anti-tuberculosis, chemotherapy, statins, NSAIDs, vascular disorder including Budd-Chiari syndrome, hypoxic hepatitis, pregnancy-related complications. These are preeclamptic liver rupture, HELLP syndrome, acute fatty liver of pregnancy. Other than those are Wilson disease, autoimmune hepatitis, lymphoma, and malignancies. The objective of our study is to determine the etiology, clinical manifestations, and outcome of fulminant hepatic failure. This study has been started since 2019 January till to the date in the Department of Gastroenterology in Jinnah Postgraduate Medical Center, Karachi, and it is a cross-sectional study. The inclusion criteria of our study are the informed consent, patients with the age greater than and equal to 12 years, total bleed greater than 5, INR greater than 1.5, and encephalopathy or ascites. The exclusion criteria of our studies are the patient and family who refuse for informed consent, age less than 12 years, chronic liver diseases, and malignancies. Study assessment. All patients of both genders greater than and equal to 12 years were recruited and investigated for acute virology, complete blood count, liver function test, renal function test, serum creatinine, ANA profile, serum ceruloplasmin levels, 24-hour urinary copper levels, ultrasound whole abdomen, ultrasound with the Doppler study, bile acid levels, mild score parameters, and King's College criteria parameters. A total number of 69 patients have been included in the study up till now. Here are the results. In our study, in the total number of the patients was 69, and the patient with the symptoms were with around 58% of the patient, that is 40 patients presented with jaundice, 7% of the patient, that is 6 patients presented with fever, 18.9% of the patient, that are 7 patients present with nausea and vomiting, and 10% of the patient presented with fatigue. Other patients presented with abdominal pain, bleeding per rectum, dyspepsia, and pleuritis. This is the slide showing the gender discrimination, that around 63% of the patients, that is 43 patients, were male, and 37% of the patients, that is 26 patients, were female. The causes of liver injury in our study were found to be that around 51% of the patient, that is 35 patients, had the cause of injury due to hepatitis E virus. 29 patients, that is 43% of the patient, were due to hepatitis A virus, and other were eclampsia, intrahepatic cholestasis of pregnancy, and autoimmune hepatitis. Around 2 patients, that is 2.9% of the patient, has had hypertension as a comorb. Rest of the patient, that is 67 patients, had no known comorb. And this is the slide which is showing the socioeconomical status, that around 42% of the patient were belonging to the middle socioeconomical status, and 58% of the patient were belonging to the low socioeconomical status.
This is the portosensory encephalopathy grading system that is showing that 10% of the patient, that is 6 patients presented with grade 1 and grade 2 encephalopathy, and 79% of the patient presented with grade 3 encephalopathy, that are 55% patients. 8 patients, that are 11% of the patient presented with grade 4 encephalopathy. In our study, around 53% of the patient, that is 76.82% of the patient needed the mechanical ventilator support. Rest of the 15 patients did not need the mechanical ventilator support. The King's College criteria, 23 patients met the King's College criteria out of 69, and presence of viral hepatitis E, serum creatinine level greater than 2.5 mg per deciliter, and sepsis were found to be associated with a high mortality rate. Only serum creatinine more than 2.5 mg per deciliter and development of sepsis were found to predict the outcome after multivariate analysis. In our study outcome, around 12% of the patient, that is 8 patients, survived, and 88% of the patient, that is 61 patient, died at the end. This is the mortality chart, which are showing that there are certain risk factors which are associated with a higher mortality rate in our study. We divided the patients in 2 categories, the pregnant patient and non-pregnant other patients. So sepsis and vent associated pneumonia were associated with showed the high significant p-value, that these 2 were the most common symptoms associated with the mortality in patient with pulmonary hepatic failure. The conclusion of my study is the mortality rate of pulmonary hepatic failure is very high, which can be reduced to some extent in a non-liver transplant area by controlling the risk factors associated with a poor outcome. So our recommendation are, we recommend all children, childbearing age group women to get vaccinated for hepatitis E vaccine, and to prevent the cause by encouraging the population to improve the hygiene and use the boiled water, by preventing the fecal-oral transmission of hepatitis E, which has turned out to be the most common cause up till now in our study. Thank you. Thank you, Gastro Society, for giving the opportunity to present my study.
Was there any difference in mortality in A and E?
Sorry, sir?
Was
Yes.
there any difference? Can you show us?
Yeah.
Did you look for hepatitis delta in these hepatitis B patients?
Yes, sir. Sorry.
Did you look for hepatitis delta in these hepatitis
Sir,
B patients?
we excluded the chronic liver disease patients. We don't, and
Shamil
we
nahi
did not see any patient with acute viral hepatitis B. Mostly all patients presented with hepatitis E and A virus.
Yes,
Even
sure.
some autoimmune hepatitis patients were unmasked when hepatitis E virus attacked them.
Can we see your slide of etiology of
Yes, sir.
hepatitis?
This is not my.
The question was the mortality different in A and E? Can you show us in that?
Yes, sir. ये यहाँ पे मेरी presentation.
Yes. Sure.
Yes, sir.
Sir, we are working in an institute where liver transplantation is not available, and the patient with the low socioeconomic status do not have the chance to get these benefits. So by improving the hygiene and by getting vaccinated for hepatitis E virus, that can decrease the burden of pulmonary hepatic failure.
I know what you mean.
Yes. Yes. Sir, we can try for it.
Sir, I did not in fact want to comment on this thing. I wanted to talk to her after the session. But the thing is that you studied the patient and you found that the patients had hepatitis E. How can you make a conclusion that prevention of hepatitis E will prevent these disorders and the vaccination will prevent the occurrence of hepatitis E? These are also positions which are not supported by your data.
Sir, you are right, but
Your
actually,
data should only
as this
say
is-
that these are the causes of pulmonary hepatic failure in our study. That's it. You cannot conclude that prevention of hepatitis E will prevent subsequent deaths also.
I think it, sorry, sir, but I think it can decrease the burden of this disease.
And this slide does not differentiate between A and E, does it? Here are the slide देखिए.
Yes, there is a, no, sir. We just collected as a whole.
ठीक.
We do
Okay.
have the data, but we have collected in our study as a whole. because it's a very simple and concise study about the clinical manifestations and outcome.
ठीक है बेटे, थैंक यू वेरी मच।
Thank
लाइमा, आपका दूसरा पेपर आप ही पढ़ेंगे, कोई और पढ़ रहा है? विल यू रीड दैट पेपर? नो सर। सैयद शायान अली।
Assalamualaikum to everyone. I'm here, Dr. Sayyid Shayan Ali, Gastroenterology Fellow at JPMC Karachi, and I'm thankful to Pakistan Society of Gastroenterology to give me an opportunity to present my paper here. The topic of my paper is the etiology of upper GI bleeding in patients presenting to Tertiary Care Hospital Karachi. So what is upper GI bleeding? Bleeding from a GI tract proximal to the ligament of Treves is called an upper GI bleed. Here you can appreciate this is ligament of Treves. So background of the study, if we talk about acute upper GI bleeding, is a potentially a life-threatening abdominal emergency that remains a common cause of hospitalization. The incidence of it is varies from 100 cases per 100,000 population per year worldwide. So you can imagine how much burden this is faced by any gastroenterologist. Bleeding from the upper GI tract is approximately 4 times more common than bleeding from the lower GI, and this is major cause of morbidity and mortality. So causes of upper GI bleed vary according to the geographical location. If we talk about the West, in the West, peptic ulcer incidence is more common, and it is 45. It ranges from 45 to 60%. And if we talk about here in this part of the world, in Pakistan, erosive gastritis, there are multiple studies in which some studies depicted that erosive gastritis is the commonest cause, while in others it shows variceal bleeding is the commonest cause. So our objective of this study is to determine the frequency, etiology, and mortality of upper GI bleed in Pakistan. This is basically prospective observational study which is conducted at Gastroenterology Department, Jinnah Postgraduate Medical Center, Karachi. And the study duration is from 1st October 2019 to 30th September 2020. We included all patients who presented to us with hematemesis, melena, or hematochezia, and whose patient age is equal or greater than 18 years of either gender. We excluded from this study of all patients who has source of bleeding in the airway, who has some severe medical problems, who refuse for EGD. If we talk about the results, total 544 patients were enrolled in our study. Hematemesis was the most common presenting complaint, which constitute 89.7%, followed by melena and hematochezia. If we talk about the result, male were the predominant in this study, which constitute 58% as compared to the female, which constitute 42%. Mean age of the patient who presented to us was 48.45 plus minus 14 years. If we talk about the comorbs, hepatitis C was the most common comorbid which we have uncrossed in our study, where that is 59.4%. This is followed by hepatitis B, which constitute 11.4%, and likewise for diabetes, which constitute 41%. These are the endoscopic findings. You can see large esophageal varices constitute majority of the patient, 59.2%, and followed by gastric varices, 32%. If we talk about varices, if we talk about ulcer, Forest class 3 ulcer was the commonest finding in our study, and severe pan-gastric erythema was seen in 17% of patients. Endoscopic intervention was done in total 338 patients, in which majority of the patients underwent band ligation, followed by gastric varices, which needs hystoacryl sclerotherapy. If we talk about compare both the group variceal versus non-variceal, in total 544 patients, 388 patients, which is majority of the patient, which constitute 71.32%, is variceal, as compared to non-variceal bleeding, which were 156 patients, which constitute 28.67. P-value is highly significant. If we talk about the mortality and morbidity of the patient who expired within 28 days were 38, constitute 7%. Rebleeding within 7 days present in 8 patients, which constitute 1.5, and recurrent bleeding was present in 37 patients, which constitute 6.8%. Mortality in patient, if we talk about age group, if when the patient we come across total 140 patients who has age greater than 60 years, out of which 34 patients were expired, which constitute 24.4%. Comorbids among patients who died, in which hepatitis C is the most common comorbid which the patient has, which constitute 47.3%. These are the AIM-65 score which we come across in every patient whose component is albumin, INR, altered mental status, systolic blood pressure, age greater than 65, and it has maximum score of 5. This is Glasgow-Blatchford scoring system in which we do in every patient. We calculate one, which is blood urea nitrogen, and likewise we give certain points on every parameter. Hemoglobin we check in male and in female. Systolic blood pressure 100 to 109 give 1 point. Likewise pulse, history and comorbids, which includes melena, syncope, hepatic disease, cardiac disease. This is the Rockall scoring system which is done in every patient, which in which we compare. This is the age, comorbidity, shock, source of bleeding, and stigmata of recent bleeding. These are the components of this scoring system. If we talk about the scores in our study, Rockall score, the mean score of Rockall score which comes in our study is 6 ± 3, GBS 8 ± 3, AIM-65 2 ± 1 out of 544 patients. So in conclusion, varicose bleeding was the most commonest cause of upper GI bleed among our population. Mortality is greater in elderly population with comorbs as compared to the young population. So our recommendation is screening EGD should be performed in every chronic liver disease patient to decrease the mortality and burden of hospitalization. Thank you for your precious time. New is basically if we talk about Pakistan, there is previous studies was done with small sample size, and there is not exact etiology not known so far. If we talk about certain areas like Sialkot, Gujarat, certain studies has been done on it, but in certain studies it is found that peptic ulcer was the commonest cause, and in certain studies it is found that esophageal varices was the commonest cause. So with large sample size to exactly know the exact etiology in this part of the world.
Was there any difference in mortality or rebleeding in patients with varicose or non-varicose bleed? Was there any difference in mortality or rebleeding in patients with varicose and non-varicose?
Rebleeding means if the patient has continuous upper GI bleed even after doing.
No. Do you have any figures in your study?
No, we basically just follow that particular patient and mention that whether the patient has incidence of rebleeding or if the patient has recurrent bleeding. So we basically enroll all those patients who expired, and out of 544, 38 patients were expired, which constitutes 7 to 8% in our study.
So while you are documenting the data, it could have been determined that prognosis in the varicose was different than prognosis in the non-varicose.
Yes,
or rebleeding incidents were different because
yes,
they would matter.
Yes, sir.
So did you notice? Did you differentiate?
We basically differentiate on the basis of a scoring system, and it has been found that those patients who has Rockall score more, Glasgow-Blatchford scoring system score is high, there is more likelihood that the patient has a poor outcome, including mortality.
Sir, if you allow, what treatments did you use in non-varicose patients?
We basically put on proton pump inhibitor in patient who has non-varicose bleed.
So endoscopic treatment was not done.
Endoscopic treatment is basically we found that most of the patient was of class 3. We put the patient on a high dose PPI. Thank you.
हारिस अल्ताफ, हारिस आप किसी और की जगह पढ़ें कि आपका नाम यहाँ पे मिसस्पेल्ड है?
Actually, the previous study on colonoscopy, I am the co-author of Dr. Haris Ahmed. Actually, I am Dr. Haris Altaf.
You are Haris Altaf.
Yes.
और हारिस अहमद की जगह पे आपने पढ़ी थी?
Yes, I am the co-author of the paper on colonoscopy.
Okay, please go ahead.
Thanks, sir. Assalamu alaikum to all. I am again here. I am Dr. Hafiz Aris, resident gastroenterology in Jinnah Postgraduate Medical Center, and I'm going to present my topic, a paper on transient elastography in chronic hepatitis B patients. The objective of my study is to determine the degree of fibrosis via transient elastography in treatment-naive patients of chronic hepatitis B. As we all know, more than 78,000 people per year dying of hepatitis B virus complications, and Pakistan is in the intermediate endemic region with an estimated carrier rate of 3 to 5%. The detection and quantification of liver fibrosis is a key factor for the disease management and prognostication for an individual with hepatitis B virus. There are various methods for evaluating fibrosis. Transient elastography is one of the techniques used in the detection of liver fibrosis and cirrhosis. What is transient elastography? Transient elastography consists of an ultrasound transducer mounted on the axis of the vibrator, which produces vibration of a mild amplitude and low frequency like 50 Hz, inducing elastic shear wave that propagates through the liver. Usually 10 measurements should be performed and the median value will be considered, and it is measured in kilopascal. This picture is showing the metabolite scoring of transient elastography. Less than between 22.5 kilopascal and 8.8, it is in mild fibrosis, which is F0 to F1. And between 8.8 to 9.6, it is a significant fibrosis, which is F2. And between 9.6 and 14.6, it is denoted as F3 fibrosis, which is severe fibrosis. And more than 14.6, it is cirrhosis, that is. Thus, transient elastography helps physicians to decide treatment strategies, predict prognosis, monitor disease progression. Methods. The study was observational cross-sectional study conducted at Gastroenterology Department of Jinnah Postgraduate Medical Center, Karachi, and it occurred from 1st December 2019 to 30th November 2020. We included all patients of either gender who were diagnosed as a case of chronic hepatitis B virus by detection of HBs antigen who have not yet initiated treatment at all. As we all know, patients who has HBs antigen for more than 6 months are known as chronic hepatitis B. We excluded patients who have already on treatment, who are alcoholic, who had co-infection with hepatitis C and D or HIV, who had malignancy, who had metabolic diseases like amyloidosis or diabetes mellitus, or who had end-stage liver disease, who had fatty liver on ultrasound, and who are pregnant. A total 68 patients were analyzed, and the mean age at the presentation was 32 plus minus with a standard deviation of 12.8 years. Among these 68 patients, male were predominant with 45 patients and corresponding to 66%, and 23 were female, which were 34%. We divided the patient among these categories like carrier, immune tolerant, chronic hepatitis B, HBe antigen positive, chronic hepatitis B, HBe negative, and CLD patients. And we found that patients who are carrier were 34, corresponding to 50%, immune tolerant corresponding 12, corresponding to 17.6%, and HBe antigens CHB were 10, and HBe antigen chronic hepatitis B were 6, and CLD were also 6. We actually divided these patients according to metabolic scoring transient elastography and found that patients who have HBV carrier, the most common score was 23. F1 score was most common in 23 patients, which corresponding to 34%, and F2, which is 11 patients, equivalent to 16%. In patients who are immune tolerant, they were most common in F1, which were 7 patients, 10.3%, F2 in 4 patients, and F3 in 1 patient. Among patients who are chronic hepatitis B HBe antigen negative, 2 patients were in F1, 3 patients in FF2, 4 patients in F3, and 1 patient in F4. Among patients who are chronic hepatitis B antigen positive, patients were in F1 were 4 and F3 were 2. And as we all know, patient who had CLD patient, F3, they were most commonly in F3 and F4, which were in 3 patients and corresponding to 4.4%. The p-value for the F1 and F2 fibrosis was significant, but the p-value for F3 and F4 fibrosis was not significant. We also divided these patients among 2 categories with minimal fibrosis like F1 and F2 and with advanced fibrosis like F3 and F4, and found that more patients were in minimal fibrosis, and in both categories, male gender were predominant, and mean age for the patient with minimal fibrosis was 29 plus minus 11 years, and with advanced fibrosis 41 plus minus 15 years. Viral load in both cases were also high, and the p-value of patient with total number, mean age, and viral load was significant. So transient elastography is a good tool for determining the fibrosis of the liver, and I recommend that all patients with diagnosis of chronic hepatitis B patient should be evaluated with transient elastography. Thank you.
Study funded externally?
Actually, I am doing residency in government setup, and transient elastography is free of cost.
Okay, that's why I was worried, because LFTs are normal and everything.
I also recommend that this facility should be cheap at centers who are private centers. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. अभी announce कर देते हैं, खत्म. Speakers to all stay back after I'm finished. I need to talk to you. Good effort all round. You need to think more about what you are doing and what you're presenting. I'll talk to you about that in a minute. The Pakistan Society of Gastroenterology has graciously announced that there will be 3 prizes, first, second, and third, and they will be given 30, 20, and 10,000 prizes each for presentations. I had with me Jan Pasawar and Dr. Asim Anwar, and we graded the presentations, and I have the results here. And I would like to request our senior colleague, Dr. Saad, who's come from Karachi, to come over and hand over the prizes, please, if he can. Thank you, sir. First goes to Laima Alam. Second to Faiza. And third will go to Haris Ahmed.
ये यहाँ
मसूद वाली जो
उनको दिए जो आपके हाथ मेरे घर के बहुत अच्छी बात है.